I have a viewer question from Chris Carey, and the question is, what causes a Haworthia to stretch out? The simple answer and the most likely answer is that it's just not getting enough light. But Haworthia can handle a lot less light than most succulents. Not all Haworthia, but most Haworthia do well in bright indirect light, and some will do well in low light conditions too. So first of all, just consider that maybe it's not getting enough light. So just look at your other plants. How are they doing? Are they stretching as well? Often when a plant's stretching because it's not getting enough light, not only is it stretching, but the pigment looks different. It'll look light colored compared to how it should look or how it typically looks. Now keep in mind that many plants at first, when that new growth is coming out, it is a lighter color than the rest. So look for that color over a lot of the plant and look for it to stay for an extended amount of time. It shouldn't be that light color for too long. We'll look at an example of that in a minute, but I wanted to talk about some other things. We're going to go into the weeds a bit here, and then I'll show you some plants and get more into what I'm talking about. So I have another theory about Haworthia that stretch. I've seen this several times in my collection. I'll buy a Haworthia from a greenhouse that has them in the blazing sun with no shade cloth. So they're pretty stressed looking and usually more compact. Now, the problem with that is when I get that plant home to my bright indirect light situation, there's a shock that takes place because that plant has been used to growing in those environments. So sometimes some of those plants they'll freak out when they get here, and it'll look like they're stretching because they're not getting enough light that they're used to. But it turns out that that plant could actually do really well in a lower light situation. But again, there's just shock and an acclimation process that it needs to get through. And then a lot of times the plant will be fine, but sometimes the plant will just continue to stretch. So it's obviously a plant that doesn't do well in that type of lighting. It prefers much more direct sunlight. It's generally thought that Haworthia are winter growers, but you know, we're talking about when they're out in the wild. Some of them are summer growers. It's going to be a lot different when you bring them inside to an artificial environment. It's just going to change things. Pretty much all my Haworthia grow all year. Now, some of them do grow more in the winter, some grow more in the summer, but in general, they'll grow a little bit all year. So you want to keep that in mind too. There could be other things affecting the stretching of the plant. I don't want to get even more further in the weeds on this subject, but just things to consider are, is your plant not really growing that much, and then you transplanted it into, say, a high nitrogen fertilizer, which promotes growth, and it just makes it freak out and grow and stretch? That could be an issue too. So just consider things like that, environmental factors, what's going on with the fertilizer, just your timing of everything. So don't freak out and think, oh, this plant is just, it's stretched, it's not going to work out. Give it some time, it might change. This is Haworthia pygmy, and it shouldn't be as light as it is, and the light pigment is present all over the plant. You can see it on the old growth, you can see it on the new growth, and you can tell that it's just not very compact. And these little offsets should be compact, darker colored, and those bubbles or bumps, whatever you want to call them, they should be more pronounced than that. So that tells me that this plant isn't getting enough light. It's been here long enough. Any kind of shock from coming from the really bright light to this more indirect bright light, that should have played out by now. But I'm going to keep this plant. It's not like I'm getting rid of it. I'm just going to try to give it some better lighting. And if I can't, it doesn't look that terrible, so it's not like I'm going to lose sleep over it. Maybe I'll put it under some lights even. But I think this is a good example of that. This plant is a good example of transplant shock. It came from a much brighter location. And as you can see, the old growth is kind of stretched out and looks a little off. That's because when I got this plant, it started to immediately stretch out and just look kind of funky. But I gave it some time, let it, go through the whole winter. It's March right now, so we're going into the spring, and it did grow over the winter. And all that new growth that you see, that looks correct. See how tight it is, the color's correct, the windows look good. It's a nice tight offset. So this plant is getting adequate light. It could probably do better with more light, but for my situation and my collection, I'm completely fine with the way it looks. Now this is an example of a plant that went into immediate transplant shock, acclimation shock, relocation shock, whatever you want to call it, because you can look at the old growth and you see how stretched out it is compared to that new growth. So that new growth, several months later after it freaked out, that new growth is reasonably tight. This plant's going to be a little bit stretched out because it does like a little more light than I'm giving it, but it shouldn't have been as stretched out as this stuff is right here. So this probably won't happen again. It'll be a little tighter than that. So I just had to wait on that because it freaked out at first. And then after it calmed down, got used to its situation, started to put out some tighter growth. The reason I'm so sure of that is because I have another one of these plants. This is a HAWORTHIA tessellata, and let me show you the other one. So this is the other one, and you can see it has tighter growth and just looks a lot better than this one, as you can see. And I've had this plant for like 6 years, so it's totally adjusted to this lighting. Alright, I had to switch to car cam because right when I was finishing up the video, my wife got home and the dog started barking, so let's just finish it up out here. I know this video threw out a lot of information, it's kind of maybe jumping around a little bit, but if you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave those below. If you like this video, it'd be great if you hit that thumbs up button, subscribe if you'd like. Feel free to share this video. Thanks for watching, and you have the best day possible.